I look forward to what happens when Trump is out of power as a Republican. I look forward to what happens after Trump. Democrats, they have a lot to figure out. Those guys, I worry for them. But as a Republican, I'm feeling pretty confident, to be honest. At least he's finally getting tired of Putin. Like, it was always inevitable that, like, Putin was going to push Trump too far, and he was going to get sick of him eventually, you know? Everybody in Russia lies. You know? A bunch of bullshit. Which the Ukrainians, you know, they got a lot of that spirit, too. So let's not pretend they're innocent in all this. But, you know, they have a lot of that. They're a corrupt ex-Soviet state, you know? They have their own issues, their own oligarchy. They have their own, Ukrainian oligarchs to contend with, just as Russia does, you know. Their own issues and their own cultural problems to deal with. But Trump was going to figure it out eventually. And when that happened, it was going to get real ugly for Putin real fast. Real fast. What's the news? Oh, so Trump has been... Well, first of all, we're about to face some really ugly spiders. So if you're an arachnophobe, get ready. Okay. Trump was making a big deal the last few days that he was going to have a big announcement surrounding the Russia-Ukraine war and that whole situation. Because basically Trump has been increasingly getting fed up with Putin just like bullshitting him and stringing him along. Because Trump, despite everything and all the many, many criticisms you can have of Donald Trump, he does seem to actually want the Russia-Ukraine war to end, which is good. And he has been getting increasingly frustrated that Putin keeps pretending he wants to end the war and then not actually doing anything. It took Trump a while.
The sloop was named after Marie Somerville, co-founder of...
It took Trump a while to realize that Putin was stringing him along, but this weekend, there was this big thing that happened where, essentially, some people in Trump's cabinet, specifically it's suspected it was Pete Hegseth, who I believe is the Secretary of Defense? I forget. People in Trump's cabinet... Oh! That's a path through the mountain. Well, that's nice. Yeah, some people in Trump's cabinet secretly turned off weapons shipments, thinking that that was what Trump wanted. And turns out it wasn't, because now Trump is getting increasingly frustrated with Putin. And over the weekend, he announced that today, Monday, there would be some new big announcement, which Trump had not decided at the time what the announcement was going to be. But today he announced that he has given Vladimir Putin 50 days to end the war or come to the negotiating table in good faith, or else he is going to levy even more severe sanctions. Hell yeah, dude, send them everything! Let them end this war. Let the Ukrainians end this war. They're willing to fight, and it gives us the chance to degrade our enemies' fighting capacity without having to send any troops in. You know, Russia is our historic enemy. This is a way we can degrade their capacity to fight without having to send in a single American troop. I mean, we should send some because it's good to get the training and the experience on the battlefield, but they don't have to storm trenches or be in anything dangerous, you know. Rear guard action, artillery, figuring out, working with the drone teams, stuff like that in the back lines. Hell yeah, send all of our old we're upgrading anyway. And that's essentially what it seems like Trump is leaning toward, is he's getting all the NATO countries, because he's also been pressuring all the NATO countries, even without the stuff with Russia, Ukraine. He's been pressuring every NATO country to really get up to that 5% spending mark. 5% of GDP spent on defense. And apparently now he's just telling them all, just send all your old to Ukraine and buy more. That way you can get to that level. Under one of the czarists of the 1800s, Russia was one of our closest allies. It's sad. Russia was never really anybody's ally, to be honest. I'm gonna be 100 with you. Russia's never really been anybody's ally. Russia occupies a very weird... there's a reason Russia is the largest country on Earth by geography. You're right. It is sad anytime that two nations are unable to speak on friendly terms. It's war is sad and horrible. I agree with you on all that, but it's also Russia. Russia exists in a strange no man's land between the East and the West. It is, in a lot of ways, actually, not directly. Yo, happy birthday! Happy birthday! Congratulations on Dirty 30. It's like being in your 20s, but your knees hurt more. Uh, anyway, we're talking about Ukraine and Russia. And I was saying, actually, Russia has, in a lot of ways, a strange set of parallels to somewhere like Israel, where it is... not like directly, but like in the sense that it is an ideological and geographic meeting point between the East and the West, which also makes it a flashpoint for wars between the East and the West. And it's a big range, basically, as opposed to Israel, which is a very small flashpoint in a very small stretch of fertile land in a big stretch of desert. Russia, essentially, the flashpoint that is... You essentially have this big, massive stretch of desert and grassland steppes all throughout Central Asia, going all the way into Eastern Europe, that basically has become a big, flat stretch of easily invadable terrain that you have to be kind of a brutal asshole in order to rule. And that's always given, whether it be the czars, whether it be the communists, whether it be the pseudo-czar such as Vladimir Putin, whether it be who was it before I don't know much about Roman history before the Romanovs, to be honest. Watch a real life lore video. I've watched a lot of content about Russia. I'll have you know. I have been following this war very closely since the beginning because I find it absolutely fascinating. I find war very fascinating. Like the old man who watches the History Channel. Stuck in a 30-year-old body that I am. And they're... I mean, I will say, I know it sounds like a real-life lore video, but, going further into the postmodern era, maybe even post-postmodern, to be honest, this might be a new era we're moving into of geopolitics. Just a whole new... It might really be just a whole new thing. It would be prudent to get used to the idea of thinking of the world in these terms, these more existential terms of nations, looking at why they act the way that they do, especially as both our culture and economies become much more insular and self-preservationist. Broken Arrow, based off what you're saying, really enjoy strategy and customization. Broken Arrow, is that a mod or is that a full game? What is that? If you want to be ahead of the curve as far as the thinking of the next era of geopolitics, I recommend taking things like this seriously, really starting to think of the world in these more existential terms as to why the mentality of nation states, why they act the way that they do, how they came to be. Russia is a brutal regime that is essentially the easternmost part of the West, if that makes sense. It is the easternmost city of the Western Empire and Western thinking, which then, of course, gives Russia a lot of Eastern thinking and a lot of insecurity about not being really one of the real Western countries, who exists as a force to exert dominance over this flashpoint, this area that's constantly getting invaded, whether it be from the east, the Mongols and the Chinese not usually, but, the Mongols and those of the steppe, those peoples, the Kazakhs, or it be from the west. They have also exerted imperial authority, though a lot of that really ramped up during the age of exploration and, of course, with naval travel. But even so, like the West has always... Russia is still a Western country that controls, like, a massive swath of Asia, and China might be taking part of it back soon. It's... I find it fascinating. Sorry, I don't have much more to say than that. I find this stuff fascinating. I find it interesting, like, looking at, like, why countries act the way that they do. Like, what are the deeper meanings? Like, who are the people involved? Who are the... it's... I think a lot of it is because, I have to bring it back around to ranting about liberals. I have to. It's required of me, like, physically in my blood. In today's day and age, a lot of the struggle that we see in the Western world is institutions fighting strongman theory, Strongman ideology, strongman politics, going into combat with, institutions and institutionalized authority of a not necessarily like a group of people, like but an institution, an idea, a collective, I guess would be a great way of putting it, a collective sense versus strongman ideology. That's been a lot of what has underscored the Trump era of American politics, the current crisis in UK politics, Keir Starmer coming to power. He is more on the collective side because that's who, both the UK and Canada went harder into the collective and institutional side after the US went for Trump. Whether or not they regret that in the long run, we don't know. Whether or not the US will regret voting for Trump in the long run, we don't know. The struggle has been institutions versus great singular men, entities, but men. That's been the struggle. And a lot of the leftist liberal ideology that has taken over the Western world is all about faith in institutions over faith in individuals, in great individuals to make decisions. And because it's so embedded in our head that, just from how we're raised, that institutions are good, institutions are what's right, institutions are what's best. Being paranoid will play. I'm glad I could help. Anyway, since we are so, I'm going to use this word just because it's funny, institutionalized to the idea that institutions are good and great individuals are bad, because that's so ingrained in us just from how we're raised, it also means that we can, it means that we often forget that institutions themselves can have their own agendas, their own desires, And just because it's a collective does not mean that collective does not have its own way of thinking, way of doing things, its own culture outside of any individual, Like your school has a culture that exists outside of any individual teacher, superintendent, principal, your job has a corporate culture, any corporation has a culture outside of any individual that, survives individual CEOs and vice CEOs and whatever's, like they do. And we're trained to think that that's always a good thing, but those individual cultures of those institutions themselves can have their own agendas, can want to do their own things. Those institutions and the cultures they create can be just as toxic as a toxic individual coming to power. You can have toxic institutions too. And so I guess that's one of the good things about Trump coming to power is it is causing us to be a lot more critical of our institutions, even though, again, I'm not a Trumper. I think Trump has been so far a mixed bag, more so than I think a lot of the Democrats want to give him credit for. And we'll have to see how the tariffs work. We're going to see. There's a lot going on with these tariffs and a lot with what's going on in the geopolitical space. We'll see what happens, It's going to depend on what China does, how they respond, whether or not the tariffs work. It's going to depend on whether or not China can hold itself together. China's falling apart. They're not going to be able to cover all this manufacturing. A lot of it's going to depend whether or not the tariffs are successful. A lot of it is going to depend on whether or not American firms can start building, Can we open up more factories? And right now, especially in a lot of Democrat states and Democrat municipalities, they're very much embedded with the idea of, ew, manufacturing's icky. No, my dad laid bricks so I could be an artist. Or whatever that John Adams quote is they're always throwing around. They don't want to... Like, manufacturing is the future, especially as China is set to collapse, within probably a couple of years, Like, manufacturing will explode, and manufacturing was the backbone of this country, especially post-World War II, the richest period of this country. It would be good if we invested in that, and if American firms... Manufacturing is the secret to making this entire country incredibly wealthy. Individuals and institutions. We could become incredibly wealthy. Every American including all of the migrants who've been shipped in, all of us could be incredibly wealthy with good investment into manufacturing over the course of the next 10 years. Whether or not we do that because Democrats just think manufacturing is icky remains up in the air.